You guys are the best. Paul, Sharon, Bella, anybody else who tunes in now. I mean, you guys are the absolute best for staying with it. Okay, wait a minute. Now what's going on? I think it's still broadcasting. Yeah. All I could say is I was going insane. So first, I apologize that we had to change the start time to 7. That was terrible. I mean, it was a good reason. I apologize for my litany of excuses. I'm just going to explain what happened. I'm not trying to excuse myself, just so you know what happened. So first we had a delay for an hour because the movie. We had our final sound mix last week, but we made some adjustments at the end. And when you make some adjustments, you can't, finalize the movie without watching it down one more time. We did that today, but the Post House... they had their own technical issues, so we weren't able to start until 4 hours late. Okay, we got through it. The movie looks great, sounds great. I was able to take my daughter with me, who's home from Colombia. Thank God she's here and not at Colombia. That's a whole other story. Anyway, it was amazing for her. She'd seen it, with a rough cut temp mix, and she was like, "Dad, when you have a final sound mix, unbelievable. It's a whole different movie." So that was great. So then I got home, plenty of time to start up the show at 7 o'clock, 1 hour late. And I just couldn't log into Facebook. And so I did all the troubleshooting, that I've tried in the past. None of that worked. Went online. Turned out that you need to update the Mevo app, which is what I use to stream. And I updated the app, and the same problem over and over and over again. I'm praying, God, please let me teach Torah. Please let me teach Torah. Why is this not working? Went through the loop 8 more times, 10 more times, 20 more times, trying this, Facebook, YouTube, Backstream, Backdoor, Mevo. And then finally, I just tried updating the app again, which I had already updated, but this is a good tip, pro tip. Sometimes you update an app and it goes to a newer version of the app, but then it can go to a newer version still. And you wouldn't know that unless you tried to update the app twice. Okay, so then it went up, but then I couldn't get on YouTube. All this time it was Facebook. I'm boring you. I apologize. All of this is to say, amazing that you're here. I'm so sorry that we're 2 hours and 23 minutes beyond the original scheduled time. Let's learn some Torah, but very important lesson that I'm trying to absorb, and that is, and applies to everything that we do, right? Any kind of success requires 2 things. That Hashem, that God should grace us with the outcome that we're looking for. And if Hashem has other plans for us, that's okay. And the other part is you do your hishtadlus. You do your part. You do the work. You do the updates. You do the investment. You do the workouts. You do all of your part. Now, once you do your part, okay. So if Hashem has other plans, you need to accept that. I need to accept that. My blood pressure was through the roof. I am not a tzaddik. I am not a righteous person. I am not a saintly person. I have not yet learned to simply accept with grace. If it's not going, it's not going. I just kept beating my head against the wall. But I really wanted to connect with you guys, and finally God allowed us to connect. I'm thrilled. Okay, who's in the house? Paul in the Great Northwest, Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Shandor in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill, the wonderful world of Gremlins, Randy in Florida, Paula, Bill. You guys are awesome. I'm so, I love you guys. That you're still here after the 2 hour and 23 minute delay. You're the best. Aoife in Florida, Chaim in Florida, Bill says, work as if everything depended on you. Pray as if everything depends on God. I love it. Ancient proverb that I've heard attributed to like 10 different sources. Perfect. Right. So exactly. So a Hasidic guy would say, you do your ishtadlus and then you leave it to Hashem. Okay. In fact, any from Yid would say that, not just a Hasidic guy. Okay. We are picking this up at the bottom of page 52b. Our daf today is 53, Nun Gimel. I had toyed with the idea of doing multiple pages since we're several pages behind. Forget that. We're just going to do the one page. It's relatively short. We're working our way through chapter 4 and continuing our discussion of Mishna. I should know this. I think it's Mishna number 3. Mishna number 3 here in chapter 4. Okay. So, apropos the statement of Chizkiah, the Gemara, this is in my power to do. I'll tell you, that lighter did not work just now. Gotta have a good sense of humor. Let's light up the darkness. Okay. Apropos the statement of Chizkiah, the Gemara analyzes the matter itself. Chizkiah said, in the case of second tithe produce, that does not have the value of one peruta, and therefore cannot be redeemed. Right? So, second tithe, right? We said it many times, when the temple was standing in Jerusalem, and we would harvest our crops in the fields around the land of Israel. First 2% teruma goes to a priest. Next 10%, first tithe, goes to a Levite. Next 10% of that, after that second tithe, we take it with us right now, like we're in the we're in the festival of Pesach, of Passover. It's a 1-week festival. And we would go up to Jerusalem. We got to eat and drink and celebrate while we're in Jerusalem. So we could take the produce of our field and eat it there, or we desacralize that produce by converting it into money, and then we bind that money in our hand, and that's what we spend on food and drink in Jerusalem. Now, the way to do that properly is, so that you're sure that you're getting a fair price, right, is to sell it to someone else. You could sell it to yourself. Hey, I have money in my purse. This is a bushel of wheat. A bushel of wheat is worth, 2 dinars. Okay, here's 2 dinars. Now I've converted my bushel of wheat into 2 dinars. The wheat is no longer sacred. Anyone can eat it. And the 2 dinars, that's my Sheni. That's sacred money, consecrated money that I can only spend in Yerushalayim. Now, if it's my own money, I have to add a 5th, right? Because, and that's to make sure that you wouldn't say, well, I only have, 2 dinars in my purse. That's all the money I have. 2 dinars is worth this bushel. I'm sure it's right. To make sure that we don't skimp when we take money from our own purse and charge ourselves too little, as it were, because once we consecrate that money, we don't have that money available for other expenditures. It's only to be used on our trip to Jerusalem. So the Torah mandates that when you sell it to yourself, as it were, and deconsecrate the produce into Meiser Sheni money, second tithe money, you have to add a 5th, right? Now, if the amount of produce that you are desacralizing into money is so small that it's not even worth a penny, then can you actually transfer its sanctity to money? Can you? So that's what we're talking about here. So Chizkiah said, in the case of second tithe produce that does not even have the value of 1 peruta, the smallest coin, imagine a penny, and therefore it cannot be redeemed because it doesn't even have that value. So one says, the second tithe produce, and it's 1/5, because I'm going to deconsecrate it to myself, that's why I'm adding the 5th, that is added when one redeems, as I just said, So the second tithe produce of this tiny amount that's worth even less than a penny, plus its fifth, because it's going to be my own money, they're going to be desacralized upon the first coins, which I already redeemed second tithe produce worth at least one peruta, because it is impossible for a person to be precise with his coins. In other words, I have just a little bit left. I don't want to throw it out because it's sacred, right? It's sacred. I can't just throw it out. But what I'm going to say is, okay, it's such a small amount. Let it be desacralized. Its sanctity transferred to money with that amount of my produce. I mean, it's not possible that I harvested my field and the only thing I came out of my field with is something worth not even a penny. It must be that I already deconsecrated some of my Meiser Sheni produce, and this little bit that's left over, I'll just include it in that because it's such a small amount. I must have already added, I'm always going to be careful to overestimate, not underestimate. That's in fact why we added the fifth. So whatever, it's going to be included in the pennies that I already used to deconsecrate. That's what Hizkiah says. So the Gemara raises an objection to this from Tractate Chala 1.9. With regard to teruma, right, the first of the tithing process, what you give to the Kohen, to the priest. So with regard to teruma and first fruits, a non-priest is liable to receive the death penalty at the hand of heaven, not at the hands of an earthly court, for partaking of them intentionally, right? So teruma can only be eaten by a priest, and it can only be eaten by a priest where the teruma and the priest are both in a state of ritual purity, tahor. They're both tahor. And if a non-priest eats teruma intentionally and says, I don't care about these laws, I'm going to have that teruma anyway, so then he's liable to karas, right? He's liable to death at the hands of the heavenly court. Something will happen to him. His life will be shortened. Maybe he'll atone and get out of it, but he's liable to that penalty. If he does it unwittingly, so then what? If he does it unwittingly and then he realizes he did it, so where am I? For intentionally, and the Torah imposes the payment of a penalty of 1/5 of the value of the produce for partaking of them unwittingly. In other words, if you did it unwittingly, you have to replace what you ate, right? What you ate that only should have been eaten by a priest. You have to replace its value or replace that teruma and add a fifth. Just like when we deconsecrate our Meiser Sheni and add a fifth, just to make sure that we, were fair dealing when we were selling it to ourselves. It's just a coincidence, or it's not a coincidence, but it's a different legal structure we're talking about here. You deconsecrate by adding your own fifth just to make sure you've added enough. And now we're talking about a penalty similar to, the robber who's going to replace what he took, and he has to add a fifth. Here, the one who transgressed unwittingly because he wasn't careful enough and he ate teruma, okay, the atonement is replace what you took and add a fifth as a penalty. Okay, now we're actually on 53a. And their consumption is prohibited to non-priests, we know. And they are the property of the priest in every sense. Meaning, once you give teruma to a priest, right, it's his teruma. He can do anything he wants with it. So what does that mean? For example, to sell them to another priest or to betroth a woman. When you betroth a woman, you have to give her something of value. So a priest can use teruma for that. And if they were intermingled with non-sacred produce, they are negated only if the ratio is 1 part teruma in 100 parts non-sacred produce, right? So meaning if it was 1 part teruma, in 10 parts non-sacred produce, and they got mixed and you don't know what happened there, so that whole mixture now becomes off limits to anyone but a priest because the teruma is not nullified. Now, normally when we're talking about something being nullified, the usual number is like 1/60th, right? So in certain situations, if like a little bit of dairy falls into your meat stew, If it's like 1 part in 70, 1 part in 60 is nullified, but let's say 1 part in 70 is definitely beyond that, so then it would be nullified. Don't rely on me. If you're ever in that situation, check with your rabbi, look up the law. But that's basically the law of nullification in 1/60th. But for teruma to become nullified within non-teruma produce, the ratio is steeper. It's 1 in 100. And what else? And so teruma requires the washing of one's hands before partaking of it. So the priest has to wash his hands, right? Since only the priest can and people in his household can partake of it. These are all laws of teruma. And one who was impure, right? So a priest who was impure, he can't eat teruma. So how does he purify himself? He immerses in a mikvah to go through purification, and then he has to wait till nightfall. And one who was impure and immersed must wait for sunset before partaking of teruma. These are the laws that are in effect with regard to both teruma and bikurim, first fruits. Again, when the temple was standing, the people would have to bring their first fruits to Jerusalem. But these are much more stringent laws than what applies to second tithe. Second tithe, obviously you can eat your own second tithe. You don't have to be a priest. So already we see that the laws of second tithe, although it is consecrated produce, are much less stringent than the laws of teruma. So the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of which is not so with regard to second tithe? Is it not by inference that second tithe is negated in a majority of non-sacred produce? Now, we already said that teruma is only nullified 1 part in 100 parts non-teruma. So now that we say that this doesn't apply to second tithe, so does that mean that it's as long as it's in a majority? In other words, if it's 49% second tithe and 51% non-tithe food, does that mean that the second tithe is nullified in that and we don't have to worry about eating it? Now, when can you eat second tithe food, right? Once you deconsecrate it, anybody can eat it because it's no longer sacred. But if you're actually going to eat second tithe produce while it's still sacred, that means you have to carry it with you to Jerusalem. You can only eat it in Jerusalem and when the temple was standing. Okay, so in that situation where it became mixed with other non-second tithe produce, is it enough that it's in a majority of non-second tithe produce for it to become nullified and you could eat it outside of Jerusalem? Let's keep reading. And if it is so that the opinion of Chizkiah is correct, and even second tithe produce worth less than 1 peruta can be redeemed, well, second tithe is an item whose prohibition has permitting factors. And the principle is that any item whose prohibition has permitting factors is not negated, even if it is in a mixture with 1 in 1,000 parts. Now, what is this permitting factors? Let's just read about that. Permitting factors. Negation. Okay. Second tithe is an item whose prohibition has permitting factors. So Tosafos asks, can one not request that a halakhic authority perform dissolution of his separation of teruma? As separation of teruma is considered a type of vow. I vow that this will be given to a priest. And therefore, teruma too would be an item whose prohibition has permitting factors. Right? It can become permitted. So they answer that there is a difference between the cases. Although the separation of teruma can technically be dissolved by a halakhic authority, dissolution of vows is a mitzvah, while dissolution of the separation of teruma is not. In fact, dissolution of the separation of teruma might even be prohibited. Therefore, its status is not that of an item whose prohibition has permitting factors, and that would be a difference between second tithe and teruma. Now, we also read here, any item whose prohibition has permitting factors. These are the items whose prohibition will lapse with the passage of time. For example, an item that came into being on a festival that will be permitted after the festival. You can't eat it during the festival, like this egg that was laid during the festival for various reasons, because it wasn't prepared for use during the festival. But once the festival ends, you could eat it, right? Whereas chametz that you possess during the festival, which is prohibited, you would never be able to eat it. But permitting factors also include an object that will lapse through an action. For example, redemption or desacralization of consecrated items. Second tithe is something that can be deconsecrated. So that's another example of having permitting factors. But the law is that something that has these permitting factors, since it has not become permitted yet, it actually does not get nullified except in a massive ratio of more than 1,000 to 1. They're much more strict with it. You would think, well, something that can become deconsecrated, it would be easier to nullify it. And in fact, it's more difficult to nullify it. So let's go back to the Gemara. The Gemara, so it would seem, so what is it? Is Hizkiah saying that second tithe can become deconsecrated and even in a majority because it's unlike second tithe? But now that we know it has permitting factors, it doesn't become it doesn't become nullified even 1 in 1,000. So, and from where is it learned that from the phrase, which is not so with regard to second tithe, one infers that second tithe is negated in a simple majority? Where did you get that? Okay, it's different than other factors with regard to teruma and bikurim. But why would you say that whereas teruma is nullified 1 in 100, that second tithe is different and therefore 1 in 2? No, why would you say that? Where do you get that? So perhaps infer that second tithe is not negated at all. You can't nullify it at all, even if it's 1 in 1,000,000. And the Gemara answers, no, you cannot say that. As with regard to teruma, the Tana in the Mishna is teaching the stringencies of teruma, but he is not teaching the leniencies of teruma. So the Gemara asks, but doesn't the Tana teach, and they are the property of the priest? That is a leniency that he can use it for whatever he wants, including becoming betrothed. Apparently, the Tana did not restrict his treatment of the laws of teruma only to its stringencies, but also spoke of its leniencies. So the Gemara states the inference that second tithe is not negated at all should not enter your mind, as it is taught explicitly in a baraisa. Second tithe is negated in a simple majority, and with regard to which second tithe, and with regard to which second tithe did the sages say this? It is with regard to second tithe that is not worth even 1 peruta. That's where we started our discussion. And which entered Jerusalem, and exited, right? So here's our problem. If you bring second tithe with you up to Jerusalem, because you're planning to eat it there, and then at the end of the festival, you didn't eat it, right? There was leftover, and then you left Jerusalem with it. So can you eat that? Second tithe is brought to Jerusalem where it is consumed by its owners. Under certain circumstances, one may desacralize the produce and transfer its sanctity to minted coins with which he will purchase food items in Jerusalem, the typical case. One may desacralize only second tithe produce that is currently outside of Jerusalem and has never been within its walls. Once it has been brought inside the walls of Jerusalem, it may no longer be desacralized, even if it is subsequently taken out of the city. That produce must be brought back into Jerusalem and consumed there. So it's just a quirk of the law of Meiser Sheni, of second tithe, that if you don't desacralize it onto money, but you actually carry your produce with you up to Jerusalem, so once it's come to Jerusalem, it's sort of like its sanctity has been goosed up a step, because you didn't change it into money. You brought it up to eat it in Jerusalem. Beautiful. But then if you don't get around to eating it and you take it out of Jerusalem, now you can't transfer its sanctity to money. Now you can't desacralize it. The only thing that you can do with it is put it away. And then at some point, bring it back to Jerusalem and eat it there. And if it's going to become, rotten or disgusting and you're not going to be able to bring it back with you, well, then you lost that second tithe. You lost the ability to consume it in Jerusalem, because once it's been to Jerusalem, and it leaves, you can no longer transfer it to money. And while it's in Jerusalem, you can't transfer its sanctity onto money. So that's the background of this law. So it is with regard to second tithe that is not worth even one peruta, and which entered Jerusalem and exited. So the Gemara now explains its objection to the ruling of Chizkiah. And if it is so that the opinion of Chizkiah is correct, and even second tithe produce worth less than one peruta can be redeemed, well, let him take action according to Chizkiah and redeem the second tithe upon the first coins, right? That Chizkiah said, if it's worth less than one peruta, don't worry about it. You already redeemed some of that produce, and whatever's left, this little leftover, consider it redeemed onto those coins. And so this is already deconsecrated produce, this small amount. So then why would you worry about that? It went up to Jerusalem and back. It was already deconsecrated. I mean, you could take some food with you that is no longer Meiser Sheni because you deconsecrated it. That wouldn't matter. So therefore, as an item whose prohibition has permitting factors, it should not be negated at all. And the Gemara answers, this is a case where he did not redeem his second tithe. He never redeemed any of it. And therefore, he has no first coins upon which to redeem the produce. And the Gemara asks, and let him bring other second tithe produce worth half a peruta that he has, and join it to the second tithe that is worth half a peruta, which is intermingled with non-sacred produce, and then he can desacralize them together. It remains an item whose prohibition has permitting factors. And the Gemara answers, second tithe by Torah law and second tithe by rabbinic law cannot be joined together. By Torah law, second tithe is negated in a majority of non-sacred produce and retains no sanctity. And it is by rabbinic law, the fence around the Torah, an added stringency, that an item whose prohibition has permitting factors is not negated. Therefore, the half peruta of second tithe that he brought, which is not in a mixture and is second tithe by Torah law, cannot be redeemed. And the Gemara continues, and let him bring half a peruta of second tithe produce from doubtfully tithed produce, known as demai, which is by rabbinic law, and join it in the intermingled half peruta. And the Gemara explains, one may not do so ab initio, lest he come to bring a half peruta from produce that is definitely tithed, which is by Torah law, and in practice one treats demai in the same manner that he treats untithed produce, and you will come to mix it up, and that's why we have this added stringency. And the Gemara suggests, okay, here's a different way to solve the problem. Let him bring 2 perutos and desacralize second tithe worth 1.5 perutos upon them. And then he can desacralize this half peruta of second tithe upon that remaining half peruta. And the Gemara says, no. Do you hold that the sanctity of second tithe produce that is worth 1.5 perutos takes effect on 2 perutos? No, the sanctity of 1 peruta takes effect on 1 peruta of the coins, and the sanctity of the half peruta produce does not take effect on anything. So once again, it becomes a case. He doesn't even have, this leftover is not even worth half a peruta, is not even worth 1 peruta, and it is second tithe by Torah law, and then the other half peruta is in a mixture that is second tithe by the rabbinic law, and second tithe by the rabbinic law does not join with second tithe by Torah law. And the Gemara asks, and let him bring an Issar worth 8 perutos and redeem second tithe worth almost that much and redeem the intermingled half peruta of second tithe upon the rest. And the Gemara answers, one may not do so ab initio, lest he come to bring perutos to redeem the produce, in which case the sanctity of the tithe will not take effect on the half peruta and the remedy will be ineffective. Now this is a beautiful discussion if you think about what we're doing here. We're talking about produce that has sanctity. It's a very low level of sanctity compared to teruma or Meiser Rishon, first tithe. It's the sanctity of second tithe, which is permitted to be transferred onto money. But you only have this tiny amount that's not even worth a penny. It's not even worth a penny. You would think you could just forget about it. But any amount of sanctity, it's sacred. It's holy. we have to account for it. We have to be careful. We have to know what are we going to do with it. And all of the devices that we would normally use to account for it, deconsecrate it, transferring it to money, it doesn't work. So they're being so careful and devoting all this space in the Talmud to figuring out what to do with this, quarter penny, half penny worth of sanctity. So let's keep reading. It is taught in a baraisa, and which entered Jerusalem and exited, right? So if Meiser Sheni, second tithe, enters Jerusalem and exits, it can't be deconsecrated onto money. And which entered Jerusalem and exited. And the Gemara asks, and why is the matter of negation in a majority even relevant to this discussion? Let him bring it back into Jerusalem and eat it. And the Gemara answers, the reference is to second tithe that became ritually impure outside Jerusalem. And the Gemara asks, but why not let him redeem it in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Elazar? As Rabbi Elazar says, from where is it derived with regard to second tithe produce that became ritually impure, that one may redeem it even in Jerusalem? Although ritually pure second tithe cannot be desacralized in Jerusalem, ritually impure, right, second tithe that is tameh, can be desacralized onto money even in Jerusalem. It is as it is stated, for you are unable to carry it, and you shall turn it into money and bind up the money in your hand. That's the general law of second tithe from Deuteronomy 14:24. And this word to carry, se'et, means nothing other than eating, as it is stated, and he took portions from before him. Masot, same root, from Genesis 43:34. Since ritually impure second tithe produce may not be consumed, Rabbi Elazar holds that one may desacralize it even if it had been brought into Jerusalem. Sounds like Rabbi Elazar's in the minority on this. We are on page 53b. So rather, the law of the Baraisa is taught not with regard to second tithe produce, but with regard to food acquired with second tithe money, which cannot be desacralized, and you can't turn the money into other money. So the Gemara asks, with regard to food acquired with second tithe money, too, let him redeem it, as we learned in a Mishna, tractate Meiser Sheni. Food acquired with second tithe money that became ritually impure should be redeemed. And the Gemara answers, the Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says food acquired with second tithe money that became ritually impure must be buried, and it may not be redeemed. So the Gemara asks, if the Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, why did the Tana teach specifically a case where the food exited Jerusalem? Even if it did not exit Jerusalem, that law also applies, as he holds that once the food becomes ritually impure, it must be buried. Rather, actually, it is taught in the Baraisa with regard to second tithe that it is ritually pure. And what is the meaning of exited? Is it not? It is not that the produce actually exited Jerusalem. Rather, the Baraisa is discussing a case where the partitions, i.e. the walls surrounding the city, fell. And the legal status of that second tithe produce is that of produce that exited the city. If you're in Jerusalem, when the walls of Jerusalem fall, it's like you're not in Jerusalem anymore. And the Gemara asks, but doesn't Rava say the law that a partition enables one to eat second tithe produce, this is by Torah law. And the law with regard to the capability of partitions of the city to gather second tithe produce into the city, this is by rabbinic law. And when the sages issued a decree that partitions gather second tithe produce in terms of their being considered within the city, they did so only where there are intact partitions. But where there are no intact partitions, the sages did not issue a decree. So the Gemara answers, once they issued the decree, the sages did not distinguish between cases where there are intact partitions and cases where there are not intact partitions, lest the people become confused. And once the sages issued the decree with regard to partitions and the produce being gathered, they applied it globally. And this is one manner of explaining the Baraisa. I'm not too far away from the end, just a few paragraphs. And maybe at the end, if you'd like to stick around, I'll mention just 2 minutes how this is very similar to the history of kitniot and why it became prohibited for Ashkenazic Jews Ashkenazi Jews, right, Northern European Jews, to eat rice and legumes, beans, during Passover, while the Sephardic Jews, the Southern Jews, Mediterranean Jews, do eat kitniot, right? Do eat rice, legumes, and beans. And I had mentioned, some earlier time in our journey together, that it was because the rabbis were concerned about the burlap bags being used to transport the kitniot might have earlier been used to transport wheat, grain products. That's a mistake. I actually learned this from my Rav yesterday. It's a different story and more interesting. So I'll just give you a 2-minute rundown at the end of that. Okay, so Rav Huna Bar Yehuda said that Rav Sheshes said the Tana Debrais is teaching one law. It is with regard to second tithe produce that is not worth even one peruta, and which both entered Jerusalem and then exited it. And it cannot be redeemed because it is worth less than one peruta. And the Gemara asks, why? And let him bring it back into Jerusalem and eat it there. And the Gemara answers, it is a case where the partitions around the city fell. And the Gemara asks, and let him redeem the second tithe produce. And doesn't Rava say the law that a partition enables one to eat second tithe produce is by Torah law, and the law with regard to the capability of partitions of the city to gather second tithe produce into that city is by rabbinic law. And when the sages issued a decree that partitions gather second tithe produce in terms of their being considered within the city, they did so only where there are intact partitions. But where there are no intact partitions, the sages did not issue that decree. They're not issuing a decree to, foresee that we're going to disqualify this produce when the walls fall. They're just saying that when the walls are standing, once you're inside those partitions, then it's like you are in that city. And if the city is Jerusalem, you can eat your second tithe there. And the Gemara answers, the sages did not distinguish between cases where there are intact partitions and cases where there are not intact partitions. So if the walls fall, then the second tithe is not in the city. And the Gemara comments, if so, why did the Tana teach specifically a case where the produce does not have the value of one peruta? The same would hold true even if it has the value of one peruta. And the Gemara answers, the Tana is speaking utilizing the style of, it is not necessary. Meaning, it is not necessary to state that if the produce has the value of one peruta, the law is that the partitions gather and it can no longer be redeemed once it is in the city. Whether it exits or not, you can't deconsecrate it onto money. But if it does not have the value of one peruta, say that the partitions would not gather it. Therefore, he teaches us that the partitions gather even second tithe produce worth less than one peruta, and it cannot be redeemed. And the sages taught that it is written, and if a man will redeem of his tithe, he shall add it to the fifth part thereof, from which it is inferred of his tithe, but not all his tithe, right? Of his tithe, not all the tithe. And this serves to exclude second tithe that does not have the value of one peruta, which cannot be redeemed. And it was stated that there is a dispute among the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, with regard to this law. Rav Ami says the second tithe cannot be redeemed in a case where the produce itself does not have the value of one peruta. Rav Asi says the second tithe cannot be redeemed in a case where its additional payment of 1/5 does not have the value of one peruta. And other Amoraim dispute the same issue. Rabbi Yochanan says the produce itself does not have the value of one peruta. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, no, we're talking about where the additional payment of 1/5 does not have the value of one peruta. Meaning that if you were going to redeem your own second tithe produce, and it was 4 perutas worth of produce, no. Interesting, where does not have the value of, right? Am I getting this right? Yeah, and you had 4 perutas worth of second tithe, and you needed to add the 5th. Okay, but the 5th of 4 is less than 1 peruta, so you wouldn't be able to do that redemption according to the opinion of Reish Lakish. According to Rabbi Yochanan, you could, because when we're talking about less than 1 peruta, we're talking about actual 1 peruta of produce, not that the additional 5th has to be at least 1 peruta. So therefore, you can only redeem your Meiser Sheni when it has a value of at least 5 perutas, so that the additional 5th would be at least 1 peruta. And the Gemara raises an objection from a Baraisa with regard to second tithe produce that does not have the value of one peruta. It is sufficient that he will say it and its additional payment of 1/5 are desacralized upon the first coins upon which I already redeemed second tithe produce. Now I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. And the Gemara explains the objection. Granted, according to the one who says there is not the value of a peruta in its additional payment. In its additional payment of 1/5, this is the reason that the Tana teaches it is sufficient, which indicates that even though in the produce itself it has the value of one peruta, since there is not the value of a peruta in its 1/5 payment, it works out well, as it is sufficient if he redeems the produce with other second tithe produce. But according to the one who says it is in a case where the produce itself does not have the value of one peruta that the second tithe cannot be redeemed, what is the meaning of it is sufficient? From the outset, there was never sufficient value for there to be any element of redemption, and the Gemara concludes, indeed, it is difficult to explain the Baraisa according to that opinion. Okay, so I'm just going to mention quickly, because I'm not seeing questions, that the history of kitniot. How did it become that the northern Jews are not able to have rice, legumes, beans, etc. during Passover? So chametz, that's what we're prohibited, right? All Jews are prohibited to have chametz. Any crumb of leavened bread that we have in our possession during Passover is a big violation, a big prohibition. That's why we clean out all our houses, etc. And God forbid we miss something. That's why we recite the nullification of any chametz we might have missed, so that legally speaking, we don't possess any chametz. And if we do possess some chametz during Passover, unwittingly, right, we would have to bring a chatas for that, a sin offering, when the temple is standing. Now we would just atone for it when we realize we did it. But that which we own, any chametz that we own during Passover, after Passover, you'd have to get rid of it. You could never consume that. That's chametz. Kitniot, rice, beans, legumes, that's not chametz, right? It is not. There was some disagreement among the sages that maybe there was one minority opinion that even these kinds of plant products could theoretically ferment and rise and become leaven, but the majority said no, it's not that they could ever become leaven. The reason there ended up being a difference, and this is only about 1,000 years old, is that, and maybe even less than 1,000 years old, but about 1,000 years old, yeah, about 1,000 years old, this prohibition. And it's because, very interesting, in the southern climates, there was one harvest a year because it was hot. And, you know, in the summer months, it doesn't rain. And basically, the land was capable of yielding a grain harvest once a year. In the northern climates, they discovered a system of crop rotation where they could plant in the same, they could divide a field into 3 parts. And there would be 2 grain harvests, right? One in the spring, one in the fall. And the third part would be planted with legumes. And that the legumes would, in the way it was done then at that time, would replenish the soil. And so they would have to rotate these thirds, which grain was being harvested in which season and which part was getting the legumes. There would be a 3-part rotation through that field. So what ended up happening is that the legumes were being grown directly alongside grain, right? And so in those climates and where this was being done, it was inevitable that some of the grain would blow onto the legumes, right? And so there literally was a bit of grain in with those legumes, and because it rained also during that season, they would not store it outdoors, they would store it in the storehouse. And that was another source of mixing the grain and the legumes. So I forget the name of the rabbi who originally came up with this stringency that, you know, that's it. We can't eat kitnios anymore because in the world in which we live, in Northern Europe, where this crop rotation came into being, it came into being about the year 960. And by the year 1060, I believe, they had issued this decree. And then some rabbis rejected it, but more and more rabbis accepted it. And eventually all the Northern European Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, no kitniya, right? So that's how it came to be. There's definitely a lot more nuance and interest in the story, but that's pretty much how it came to be. Sharon had one question. Seems unfair to a poor farmer who has only a small quantity of produce to be unable to be desacralized. I mean, it's such a small amount, right? Less than 1 peruta, the smallest coin there is. I mean, it's like, I think if you have any field at all, you're going to have more than that. I think this is more in that hypothetical range, or because you found some produce that you forgot about, and then you need to, you found some Meiser Sheni that you had set aside, and that kind of spilled off the table behind the cabinet. Now what are you going to do with it? I think it's much more the exercise of following the law to its conclusion than something that a farmer would really have to deal with. That's my impression. I could be wrong, but that's my impression. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. Thank you so much, everybody, for being patient and forgiving with me and all the technical difficulties we had. I mean, my only excuse is that, the streaming app that I use with this camera was updated during the holiday that we were off. And apparently it was updated twice and whatever. Who needs to hear all that story? But I think I know we're up and running today, and God willing, we'll be up and running again tomorrow at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific, please God. All the best and a good Moed. I hope that if you're celebrating Passover, you're enjoying these intermediate days.